Hello and welcome to TIM-DND. Today we'll talk about character creation and the differences between what was in the Rules Cyclopedia and what's currently in 5e. So, rolling ability scores. For this book, you'd roll 3d6, one by one for each of the characteristics your character was going to have, and you'd basically choose what character you were going to be based on where your highest number fell. If it was in strength, you might be a fighter. If it was in intelligence, you might be a wizard. Wisdom, you might be a cleric, and so on. In 5e, you roll 4d6, automatically going to be a higher number. You remove the lowest number, but still you've got more chance of getting a high number on those. You basically put those where you want in the 6 characteristics that apply to a character. So if you want to be a fighter, you choose to put the strength as your highest number, and so on. For 5e, it's giving you the choice of what character you want to roll. For this edition of the book, you basically had to work out a character based on what you'd rolled. You could choose to be a fighter with a low strength, but that would affect not only how hard it was for you to hit something in combat, but also it affected how much experience points you gained. If you had a low strength, you'd gain experience at a lower rate because you were behind the curve as such. So the long and short of it is, if you with this book, if you rolled poorly in a certain area, you wouldn't even try and focus on that. There were rules in here which allowed you to move some of the numbers from one of your characteristics to the one you wanted to be good at. So if you'd rolled a 15 in strength and you wanted to be a fighter, you could move some points from your intelligence score into that strength score. But this was a ratio of 2 to 1. So you could move the points from intelligence. So if you'd rolled a 9 for intelligence, you could move 2 from there and add 1 to your strength to make it 16, which took your intelligence down to 7. So there was a marked problem with trying to move the statistics around. It gave you disadvantages. In 5e, obviously you've already moved things around as you wanted them, and then you get to choose the race of your character and the class of your character according to where you've put things. And we'll talk about that next. So you've rolled your characteristics, and in this game, you then have a choice based on what those characteristics are of picking a fighter, a wizard, a cleric, a thief, or if you've rolled high enough in enough of the characteristics, you could choose to be a demi-human, in other words, a dwarf, an elf, or a halfling. The demi-humans needed you to be good in normally 2 different areas rather than just the one. So a dwarf needed you to be good in strength and also have a constitution of 9 or more. So the demi-humans didn't get seen as much because the way you'd rolled the character, you were less likely to see decent results in those scores. So in terms of choice of what you wanted to be, it was reliant on what you'd rolled, and then you could basically fill in a character around those scores. Total choices, I forgot to mention Mystic as well, which was in there. You could be a druid in these rules, but only after you'd been a cleric for 9 levels, I think. You had to convert your cleric, which was neutral, into a druid later on in the game. We won't focus on that now, it's very complicated. Compared to that, you've basically had 8 classes you could choose to be. Compared to that, you had in 5e, you've got 9 different races you can choose and 12 different character classes just in the player's handbook. and you can be those classes in any of those races and what have you. So that gives you 108 choices just there, not including sub races and subclasses. So I think there's probably, well, at least 1,000 different options you could choose with those or two different sections. Certainly 108 different options just on the race and the class. And because you've moved your results for your characteristics in exactly where you wanted them to be, you could choose all of those. It wouldn't matter. If you were going to min max, you could definitely pick a stronger character to be a fighter. A stronger race to be a fighter or a barbarian type character, like a dragonborn or a half orc. Um, and you could certainly choose a elf character if you were going to be a ranger because they have higher dexterity and such like. Um, of course, you could also try and get rid of some of your weaknesses by picking a race which gives you extra toughness or extra strength when you're a character which would normally be weak. These are all options, and that is entirely up to you what you choose. In the encyclopedia, if you chose a character which didn't match your statistics, as I said earlier, it would minimize how well you did with gaining experience, and generally give you a worse time, unless you're into playing a weakling barbarian with a strength of 10 or something, who could barely lift his sword up. If that was your thing, you could do it, but it didn't lead you to the best character in the world. In the cyclopedia, you rolled hit points for your first level character. For a thief or a wizard who are quite weak, certainly at the start of the game, you would roll a single d4 for your hit points and add your constitution modifier. A d4. If you got a 1, then you had 1 hit point. That went up if you were a cleric or an elf. You rolled a d6. If you were a fighter, you rolled a d8. I think that was the highest you could roll. D8 for a fighter or a dwarf. They were the high numbers you could roll. Again, if you were a fighter and you rolled a 1 for your hit points, that was what you had with your constitution bonus. So you could be a first level fighter with, say, 3 or 4 hit points, and that was as good as it was going to get until you gained level. In 5e, obviously, the hit points number is higher. I think the lowest you would get is a d6 for a wizard or a sorcerer. And a thief a rogue in 5e would roll a d8. But at first level, you don't have to roll that number. You automatically get the highest number you could have got with the constitution bonus. So already with 5e characters, you're starting with a 6 if you're one of the lower hit point creatures, say a sorcerer or wizard. You automatically got 6 plus your constitution bonus. And because you position things as you'd want them, most of these characters tend to try and get a reasonable constitution, at least a +1 or 2 in that, because it not only helps with their survivability, but it also helps them to maintain concentration on spells and things if they get damaged while casting a spell. Clearly, 5e characters are a lot more survivable than the characters in Encyclopedia. If you were a thief or a wizard, you stayed at the back, you hid behind your friends, and you tried to stay out of trouble as much as possible. Heroism is for people with hit points. The biggest difference between the two editions is definitely in the spells. In this version of the game, the wizard, the elf, and the cleric are the three spellcasters. I say wizard; it was magic user in this game. Um, those were the three spellcasters for this version of the game. At first level, the wizard had a spell book with two spells in it, two, and they were able to memorize from that book one spell. They would go into a dungeon with a group of other people with one spell available to them. I don't know how they survived. The cleric had no spells at first level. None at all. They didn't get their first spell until they were second level. The cleric is the healer of the party. They're the only ones who have got healing magic. But at first level, they didn't have any healing magic at all. The cleric also can wear armor and things, and can carry weapons, but not as many as the fighter, and they had less hit points. So for the first level, a cleric was basically a less able fighter. They did have a turn undead ability as well. But if your first game was against goblins, that didn't really come into it anyway. But there, that was the cleric. The elf is the third type of spellcaster. They had the same spells as the magic user, and at first level they had the same number of spells in a spellbook. They didn't have the same disadvantage as the magic user, however, because they had those few extra hit points. They could wear armor and still cast spells. They could carry weapons and fire bows and things. So the spell was basically an added bonus rather than their be-all and end-all. Once the wizard had cast his spell, he was basically carrying around a little dagger. Possibly, if your DM was lenient, he would also carry a wooden staff, a quarterstaff, for protection. They couldn't wear armor, and they were sitting ducks if they were ambushed or got caught one-on-one with a monster, which is a problem when your cleric can't cast heal wounds. In 5e, your magic users have got a number of spells. Your wizard, for instance, which is the closest equivalent to the magic user in this version of the game, has like six spells, I think it is, in his spell book, and can memorize a number of them, and has about 2 or 3 spell slots at first level. They also have cantrips, which are basically low-level spells which they can cast whenever they want without using a spell slot, without losing the memory of that spell. So the days of having to hold a dagger out when you'd used your last spell were gone as far as 5e is concerned. The same with the sorcerer, who again had spell slots, a number of spells and some cantrips. And any other spellcaster in this in the 5e book. The warlock is probably the closest in reduced spells to the old magic user, with only one spell slot at first level. But again, the warlock has cantrips, and the warlock is able to wear some armor and carry some weapons. So the poor old magic user in this edition at first level, he's a weak guy who needs all of the help from his friends. Clerics in 5e get healing magic from the word go. They are the known healers for the party. There are a few other character types that can use healing spells or some sort of healing. Druids, bards. Paladins have got healing magic straight from the get-go. But ultimately, it's your cleric who you want in the back as a healer, because the other races, sorry, the other character classes have all got other things that you'd much rather be doing rather than casting heal wounds or healing word. So spells didn't happen very often in the first edition of the game. And when they did happen, you really wanted them to have a big effect. If they didn't, if you cast sleep and your DM said, "I'm sorry, but that monster isn't affected by the sleep spell," you'd be gutted because that was your thing for the whole adventure. So that's magic in these games. Very different from what it was. I would say that this setting, it's almost a low magic setting with how much spells you could get, certainly at first levels. And to be honest, until you were up in the level 5, 6, 7, you had very little resources as a wizard. And you felt like you were being carried by the party for the first few levels of the campaign. So once you've started adventuring in the encyclopedia rules, you're gaining experience points. But depending what character class you are, you're gaining them at a different rate. You're gaining levels, I should say, at a different rate. An elf, because they are learning fighting and magic, they take 4,000 experience points before they can go up a level. A fighter only has to get 2,000. A wizard, because they're focusing on the magic, can get to a second level, but at 2,500. Um, all of the classes have got different points where they will level up, which could mean that you would have a party of some second level, some first level, and maybe even some third level characters who have all gained experience points at the same at the same rate, but gone up at different points. In 5e, you go up a level to second level after 300 experience points. I should point out that the thousands mentioned in here are because that in this game you gain experience not just from killing monsters and fulfilling quests, but also from gaining gold. So the more gold you had, the more experience points you gained. Literally, one gold piece gave you one experience point. Comparatively, in the 5e game, you only get the experience from quests and from killing monsters or defeating monsters. So there's a big difference there. On top of that, with this game, you got a bonus to how fast you would gain experience points if your skill in a certain characteristic was high. So if you had a high strength and you were a fighter, you would get an extra 10%, I think it was, to the experience points you had earned each adventure. If you had a low score in that particular characteristic, you would have a minus 10% to the amount you brought back. So this really did focus in on the characteristics of your character being in the right spot. You didn't get a bonus from playing a weak fighter or playing a stupid wizard. You got a minus. In 5e, none of that really affects things. You gain experience at the same rate as everyone else. If you're not very good at what you're doing, you still gain experience for being there. To a certain extent, it reminds me of school sports days where everyone's a winner. Modern days, perhaps, with the 5e rulebook. I do think it's nicer that in 5e everyone levels up at the same time. Everyone's been on the adventure together. They've all done the same quest. It's nice that because they've done that, at certain points they will all level up. I do think 300 experience points isn't very much. You can probably get there within one or maybe two adventures, depending how difficult they are, and what you're facing, and how lenient your GM is with giving out extra experience points for doing good stuff. In the encyclopedia, you could possibly be going on 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 adventures, especially if you've got a stingy DM who doesn't give out much gold, before you've gone up one level. And frankly, with the few hit points that you have at the beginning and the few spells that you have and no healer, if you survive more than one adventure, you're doing pretty well. So that's the main difference between the experience of these two games. So all of those differences make this version of the game far more scary when you're adventuring. Far more likely that your party is going to be wiped out by 4 or 5 goblins. Far more tense when you turn a corner in the dungeon. It makes the characters feel like they're really at risk. The 5e rules, you can still feel very tense and very worried, especially if your DM is clever enough to put that fear in you. But realistically, your characters feel far more prepared for the danger ahead of them with a 5e game. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I think they're two different versions of the same game. The 5e rules encourage you to roll a character which is basically a superhuman. You're far more advanced than a normal commoner. You're far more advanced even than like a town guard who's been trained in some degree of fighting, and is armed and armored. This version of the game, you're still supposed to be far more than a common person. I don't feel you really feel it with the rules as they stand in this game. In fact, in my home game, when we played with this rules, I seem to remember rolling characteristics, and we would roll the 3d6 8 times and discard the 2 lower results, and then we'd assign them where we wanted in order to be able to pick what sort of character we were going to be. This worked for us as a group. It meant that we had a choice of what sort of character we were going to roll, and it meant that our character was slightly more proficient than it would have been had we just rolled the 6 times and seen what happened. And I suppose those sorts of homebrewing versions of the rules are what led in turn to 5e, slowly and surely over the years. As I've said on my previous video, I wasn't around for those different versions of the game. I never played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is like the first edition of the current game as such. I only played the very basic rules. And we enjoyed the basic rules, and we adapted them to what we needed at the time for our group. Personally, I think the rules of 5e work better for my current group of my 2 stepchildren. And I wouldn't want to try and go back to using this version of the game. But there are some soft spots I have for this game. And I quite enjoy wiping out a party with a few goblins. Until next time, please like and subscribe and do all the YouTube things you can do. And I'll see you around.